Molly's trembling hands gripped the church pew as Wade Sterling stood before the congregation, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "I have something to tell you all about my dear brother Thomas and the woman he abandoned." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized the man she'd fallen in love with wore her former fiancé's face, and everything she thought she knew was about to shatter. Molly Crane pressed her needle through the delicate ivory silk one final time, securing the last pearl button on what should have been the most important dress of her life. At 24, she had stitched together countless wedding gowns for other women in Millbrook, each one a reminder of dreams that seemed to slip further from her reach with every passing year. Her plain features and sharp tongue had never attracted much male attention in their small frontier town until Thomas Sterling arrived like a whirlwind 6 months ago. The morning light filtered through her small sewing shop window as Molly smoothed the dress against her modest frame. Thomas had promised her everything: a real home, children, a life beyond the confines of measuring tape and thread. His charm had been intoxicating. The way he'd swept into her orderly world with grand gestures and passionate declarations that made her believe she was beautiful, desirable, worth loving. Church bells chimed across the dusty street, their bronze voices calling the town to witness her transformation from spinster seamstress to bride. Molly's hands trembled as she gathered her skirts, walking the familiar path she'd taken every Sunday for years, though today felt different. Today, she would finally claim her place among the married women, leave behind the pitying glances and whispered conversations about poor Molly Crane, who couldn't catch a husband. The church doors stood open, revealing pews filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Henderson from the general store sat primly in the front row, her eyes bright with curiosity. Behind her, the banker's wife leaned forward, clearly eager for the spectacle. Even Ruby from the saloon had appeared, her painted lips curved in what might have been a smile or a smirk. Molly stepped inside, her heart hammering against her corset stays. The congregation turned toward her with expressions she couldn't quite read. Not the warm anticipation she'd expected, but something else entirely. Pity, perhaps. Or was it discomfort? She moved down the aisle with measured steps, each footfall echoing in the strange silence. The Reverend stood at the altar, his weathered face grave, his hands clasped tightly before him. But the space beside him remained empty. No Thomas, no groom waiting with nervous excitement to claim his bride. The whispers started low, a gentle rustling like autumn leaves, but they grew louder with each step she took. Molly's stomach clenched as reality began to settle over her like a suffocating blanket. She reached the altar and turned, searching the faces of her neighbors, looking for some explanation that would make sense of this nightmare. "I'm afraid there's been a development," Reverend Matthews said quietly, his voice barely carrying beyond the front pews. He pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his vest pocket, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. "Thomas Sterling left this for you." Molly's vision blurred as she read the hastily scrawled words. Thomas's familiar handwriting spelled out her humiliation in careless loops. He'd followed his heart, chosen love over duty, left town with Ruby for a new life somewhere far from Millbrook. The paper felt impossibly heavy in her hands, each word a weight that threatened to drag her to her knees. The silence stretched until someone in the back pews coughed, and suddenly everyone seemed to be moving at once. Neighbors filed out with uncomfortable murmurs, their eyes avoiding hers. Mrs. Henderson patted her arm with false sympathy before hurrying away. Even Ruby had vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of cheap perfume and triumph. Molly stood alone in her handmade wedding dress, surrounded by empty pews and wilted flowers, understanding with crystal clarity that she had become exactly what she'd feared most, the town's cautionary tale about plain women who dared to dream too high. The weeks that followed blurred together like watercolors in rain. Molly buried herself in her sewing shop, the familiar rhythm of needle and thread becoming her sanctuary against the whispered conversations that died whenever she entered the general store or walked past the hotel. Mrs. Henderson would offer those tight-lipped smiles that spoke louder than words, while the banker's wife suddenly found urgent business elsewhere whenever Molly appeared on the street. She had just finished hemming a blue cotton dress for the school teacher when the shop bell chimed. The man who entered filled the doorframe completely, his shoulders broad beneath a well-tailored coat that spoke of money and good taste. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, his boots polished to a shine that suggested he hadn't spent the morning mucking through Millbrook's dusty streets. "Miss Crane?" His voice carried a familiar timbre that made her heart stutter, though his bearing was entirely different. Where Thomas had been all nervous energy and quick movements, this man possessed a stillness that commanded attention. "I'm Wade Sterling, Thomas's brother." The needle slipped from Molly's fingers, clattering to the wooden floor. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same strong jawline, the same deep brown eyes, yet everything else felt different. This man looked at her directly, without the shifty glances Thomas had developed in his final weeks in town. "I didn't know he had a brother." The words came out sharper than she intended, but Wade simply nodded as though he'd expected her wariness. "We've been estranged for years. I've been traveling, building my ranch operation in the next county." He removed his hat, revealing hair that caught the afternoon light streaming through her shop window. "I heard what happened. I came to apologize for my family's behavior." Something twisted in Molly's chest at the word family. She'd thought herself part of that family once, had imagined Sterling children playing in a yard somewhere, calling her mother. Now she was just another woman wronged by a Sterling man, apparently worthy of apologies from strangers. "Your brother made his choice." She bent to retrieve her needle, grateful for the excuse to look away from his face. "No apology needed." Perhaps not needed, but deserved nonetheless. Wade stepped closer to the counter, his presence somehow warming the small space. "Would you allow me to buy you dinner at the hotel? I have stories about Thomas that might help you understand." The invitation hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she wanted to cross. The hotel dining room would be full of the same people who'd watched her humiliation, who'd whisper behind their hands about poor Molly Crane dining with another Sterling man. Yet something in Wade's steady gaze suggested he wasn't offering charity or pity. She surprised herself by accepting. That evening, Wade held her chair with careful attention, ordered wine without asking the price, and spoke to her as though her thoughts mattered. He told her about Thomas's childhood tendency to run from difficulty, about promises broken and responsibilities abandoned, long before he'd ever heard of Molly Crane or Millbrook. "He always wanted what looked easiest in the moment," Wade explained, cutting his steak with precise movements. "Never understood that the best things require work, patience." Molly found herself studying his hands as he spoke. They were Thomas's hands, down to a small scar between thumb and forefinger that she remembered kissing once. Yet they moved differently, with more confidence, less of the restless fidgeting that had marked her former fiancé. Over the following days, Wade appeared at her shop with increasing frequency. He brought her small gifts, a bolt of fine fabric from the next town over, a box of good thread, once a book of poetry that made her laugh at its romantic absurdity. Unlike Thomas's grand gestures that had always felt performed for an audience, Wade's attention seemed meant for her alone. "You're different than I expected," he said one afternoon, watching her work on a complicated alteration. "Thomas described you as quiet, accommodating." Thomas saw what he wanted to see. Molly's needle moved in sharp, efficient strokes. "Most men do." Wade smiled at that, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face. "I'm beginning to think Thomas was a fool about many things." The compliment settled warm in her chest, though she tried to dismiss it. Wade Sterling was wealthy, successful, undoubtedly destined for some beauty from a bigger city with proper connections and a substantial dowry, yet he kept appearing at her door, kept seeking her company, kept looking at her as though she were something precious rather than discarded. When he proposed just 2 weeks after arriving in Millbrook, Molly stared at the simple gold band he offered with complete bewilderment. "You barely know me," she whispered. "I know you survived my brother's betrayal, with your dignity intact. I know you work harder than most men in this town. I know you're beautiful when you smile, which you don't do nearly enough." Wade's voice carried absolute certainty. "I know I want to spend my life proving Thomas wrong about everything, starting with his judgment of you." The wedding ceremony was small, private, nothing like the spectacle she'd planned with Thomas. But as Wade slipped the ring onto her finger, Molly felt something she'd never experienced with his brother. Genuine partnership. This man saw her clearly, appreciated her sharp wit instead of trying to soften it, valued her strength rather than expecting helpless femininity. Wade's ranch proved as impressive as he'd claimed. A substantial house with proper furniture, good land, cattle that looked well tended. He'd built something real here, something lasting. As he carried her across the threshold, Molly allowed herself to believe that perhaps she'd found her place at last. Their nights together revealed depths that Thomas had never possessed. Wade listened when she spoke, asked her opinions on ranch business, seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts about everything from politics to poetry. In bed, he was patient and attentive, coaxing responses from her body that left her breathless and wondering how she'd ever thought herself satisfied with Thomas's hurried affections. Yet, as weeks passed, small details began troubling her seamstress's eye for precision. Wade's laugh was identical to Thomas's. Not similar, but exactly the same. His coffee preferences, his way of reading the newspaper, even his unconscious habits while thinking, all perfectly matched her memories of his brother. When she mentioned these similarities, Wade attributed them to shared childhood, identical upbringing, the mysterious bonds of family. But doubt crept into her thoughts like water through loose stitching, small at first, but gradually weakening the entire fabric of her new happiness. One morning, while organizing Wade's wardrobe, Molly discovered a shirt she recognized. Dark blue cotton with mother-of-pearl buttons she'd sewn on herself during her engagement to Thomas. The sleeves had been shortened, the shoulders taken in, but her stitching remained unmistakable. Her hands trembled as she held the altered garment, her mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same terrifying conclusion. The man she'd married, the life she'd built, the love she'd found. Everything balanced on the edge of a revelation that would destroy her world again. This time, though, she wouldn't wait passively for truth to find her. Her fingers traced the familiar stitching on the blue cotton shirt, each thread a small betrayal that unraveled the careful lies she'd been living. Molly's breath caught as she examined the altered seams. Someone had taken in the shoulders and shortened the sleeves with clumsy, hurried stitches that insulted her professional eye. But underneath those crude modifications lay her own precise handiwork, the mother-of-pearl buttons she'd sewn with such hope during her engagement to Thomas. Wade found her sitting on their bedroom floor, surrounded by his scattered clothing. His face went pale when he saw what she held. "You can explain this, can't you?" Her voice sounded strange in her own ears, too calm for the hurricane building inside her chest. "Tell me another story about shared belongings between brothers, about how estranged twins somehow end up with the same shirt." Wade's mouth opened and closed without sound. For the first time since she'd known him, the confident rancher looked lost, desperate, caught. "Molly, please let me—" "Don't." She stood slowly, the shirt falling from her hands like a discarded costume. "Don't say my name in that voice. I need to know who's been saying it." The confession spilled out of him in broken pieces. There was no twin brother, no wealthy rancher from the next county, no Wade Sterling at all. Just Thomas, who'd returned after 3 months of misery with Ruby to discover that abandoning Molly had been the greatest mistake of his worthless life. Ruby had left him for a gambler in Denver, taking what remained of his savings and his pride. "I came back to nothing," he said, his hands shaking as badly as hers had on their first wedding day. "No money, no respect, no future. But I'd learned something about myself, about what I'd thrown away. You were the strongest person in this town, and I'd been too stupid to see it." Molly listened to his explanation with the detached fascination of watching a train wreck. He'd planned the deception carefully. Rented the ranch property, bought new clothes, practiced a different way of speaking and moving. Wade Sterling was meant to be everything Thomas wasn't. Successful, confident, worthy of her. "I fell in love with you all over again," he continued desperately. "But not as Thomas, as Wade. You became this incredible woman after I left, and Wade Sterling was the only man good enough for who you'd become." The words hit her like physical blows. Every moment of happiness, every night of passion, every dream of their future together had been built on a performance. The man who'd made her feel beautiful and valuable had been playing dress-up with her life. "You gathered the whole town," she said quietly, remembering his announcement that morning about revealing Thomas's character. "You were going to humiliate him publicly. Humiliate yourself." Thomas, she couldn't think of him as Wade anymore, nodded miserably. "I thought if I destroyed Thomas Sterling's reputation completely, Wade Sterling could exist forever. We could be happy, and no one would ever know." But Molly had figured it out first, her seamstress's eye catching the details he'd missed. The careful deception crumbled under her scrutiny like poorly constructed seams under stress. The congregation was still waiting when they arrived at the church. Thomas stood before the gathered townspeople, his prepared speech about his brother's cowardice dying on his lips as Molly walked to the front pew. She could expose him now, watch him squirm under the weight of his own elaborate lies. The justice would be perfect, the deceiver deceived, the humiliator humiliated. Instead, she stood and faced the crowd herself. "Thomas Sterling is a fool," she announced clearly. "But he's not a villain. He made a mistake, learned from it, and tried to fix it the only way he knew how. I forgive him for everything, including thinking I needed saving." She turned to Thomas, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. "But forgiveness doesn't mean I'll keep living your lie. Goodbye, Thomas." Walking out of that church for the second time, Molly felt something she'd never experienced before. Complete freedom from other people's opinions of her worth. Thomas watched her walk away, the sound of her boots echoing against the church walls like a final verdict. The congregation sat in stunned silence, processing what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Henderson's mouth hung open, the banker's wife clutched her husband's arm, and even Reverend Matthews seemed at a loss for words. The man who had been Wade Sterling for 2 precious months felt the carefully constructed identity crumble around him like autumn leaves. Without Molly's presence to give it meaning, the wealthy rancher persona felt as hollow as his original plan for revenge. He'd created Wade to win her back, but she was walking away from both versions of himself. "Well," he said to the silent crowd, his voice cracking slightly, "I suppose that's that." Outside, Molly breathed the crisp morning air and felt lighter than she had in months. The weight of deception, of living someone else's version of her story, lifted from her shoulders. She'd loved Wade Sterling deeply, but Wade Sterling had never existed. Thomas was real, flawed, and desperate and human, but she couldn't build a life with a man who thought she needed saving from the truth. Behind her, she heard the church doors open and close as people filed out, their voices rising in excited whispers about the morning's drama. Let them talk. She'd survived their pity once before. She could survive their curiosity now. Thomas appeared at her elbow, walking beside her without invitation. "The ranch lease runs through next month," he said quietly. "You could keep the furniture, the clothes, everything Wade Sterling bought for you." "I don't want Wade Sterling's things." She kept walking toward her sewing shop, toward the life she'd built with her own hands. "And I don't need Thomas Sterling's charity. What if I became someone else entirely? Started over somewhere new?" Molly stopped and looked at him. Really looked at him. Beneath the careful grooming and expensive clothes, she could see the boy who'd run away from every difficult thing he'd ever faced. He was still running, even now. "The problem was never which name you used," she said gently. "It was that you thought love meant pretending to be someone else." She left him standing in the dusty street, sunlight warming her face as she unlocked her shop door. Inside, 3 wedding dresses waited for finishing, their ivory silk gleaming with promise. Molly smiled as she picked up her needle. This time, she was sewing dreams that belonged to other women, and that felt exactly right.